In 1944, British intelligence needed someone to run all operations against the Soviet Union. They chose Kim Philby. It was the most catastrophic decision in the history of Western intelligence. Philby had been a Soviet agent since 1934. For 10 years before his appointment, he had been passing British secrets to Moscow. Now he was being handed the keys to everything Britain knew about the KGB, every agent, every operation, every method. He passed all of it to the Soviets. He was not caught for another 19 years. In those 19 years, Philby served as the chief British liaison with the CIA in Washington. He lunched regularly with the head of CIA counterintelligence and extracted every American secret the man possessed. He warned 2 fellow Soviet agents that they were about to be arrested, giving them time to defect to Moscow. He destroyed an operation that sent thousands of Albanians back into their homeland to start a resistance movement. They walked directly into ambushes he had arranged. When British intelligence finally confronted him in a wired apartment in Beirut in January 1963, his closest friend opened the door. Philby looked at him and said, "Ah, I rather thought it would be you." 12 days later, he was gone. A Soviet freighter left Beirut that morning so abruptly that cargo was still scattered on the docks. Philby was on it. His confession, recorded in that Beirut apartment, was classified by the British government for more than 50 years. Parts of it are still withheld today. His name was Kim Philby, and this is how the most trusted man in British intelligence was working for the other side the entire time. To understand how Kim Philby became what he became, you need to understand where he came from. And where he came from was a world that trusted its own kind completely. Harold Adrian Russell Philby was born on January 1, 1912, in Ambala, in British India. His father, Harry St. John Philby, was a British diplomat and explorer, brilliant, eccentric, impossible, who would later convert to Islam and become an advisor to the Saudi royal family. The family called the boy Kim, after the Rudyard Kipling character, the British boy raised in India who becomes a spy for the empire. The irony would eventually become impossible to ignore. Philby was sent to England for his education, following the path that children of the British imperial class had followed for generations. Westminster School, then Trinity College, Cambridge, in 1929. Cambridge in the early 1930s was a particular kind of place at a particular kind of moment. The Depression had devastated working-class Britain. Fascism was rising across Europe, in Germany, in Italy, in Spain. The Soviet Union, under Stalin, appeared to be the only power actively organizing resistance to the fascist advance. For a certain kind of idealistic young man at Cambridge in those years, communism was not a fringe position. It was, in the words of those who were there, simply the obvious response to an obvious problem. The capitalist system had failed. Fascism was the result. Only Soviet-style communism offered a structural alternative. Philby joined the Cambridge Socialist Society. He began reading Marx seriously. He became, by his own later account, a committed communist, not a fashionable leftist, but a man who had genuinely concluded that the Soviet system was the correct answer to the political crisis of his time. In this, he was not alone. The men who would become the Cambridge Five came from the same world, breathed the same air, reached similar conclusions by similar routes. Guy Burgess was the most flamboyant, brilliant, charismatic, perpetually drunk, reckless in his personal life, and utterly devoted to the Soviet cause in the way that only a man of absolute social confidence can be devoted to anything. Donald Maclean was more contained, the son of a liberal cabinet minister, a high-achieving diplomat with a hidden crisis at his center. Anthony Blunt was older, an academic, a fellow of Trinity College who served more as a talent spotter than an active agent. John Cairncross was different from the others, working class in origin, prickly in manner, contemptuous of the establishment he was simultaneously penetrating. And then there was Philby, who was, by every account, the most dangerous of all of them. The man who found Philby was Arnold Deutsch. Deutsch was a Czechoslovakian NKVD officer working undercover as a postgraduate student at London University. He had been sent to Britain in January 1934 with a specific brief: identify and recruit British subjects who could be developed as long-term assets inside the British government. Not people who were openly communist. People who were communist in conviction, but not yet communist in public identity. People who could be persuaded to keep their politics invisible and instead build careers inside the British establishment, carrying their beliefs and their Soviet connections as a hidden architecture beneath a conventional surface. Philby, in his 1963 confession to Nicholas Elliott, recorded, transcribed, and classified by the British government for 50 years, described his first meeting with Deutsch in Regent's Park. He called him Otto. That was the cover name Deutsch was using. He said, "He was a marvelous man, simply marvelous. I felt that immediately, and the feeling never left me. He looked at you as if nothing more important in life than talking to you existed in that moment." Deutsch's instruction to Philby was specific and counterintuitive. Break off all contact with your communist friends. Stop attending socialist meetings. Stop reading Marx in public. Build a surface identity. As a journalist, as a member of the establishment, as a man whose politics were conventional and whose loyalty was unquestioned, become invisible as a communist, and then use that invisibility to go somewhere useful. Philby was 22 years old. He agreed immediately. The process of building his cover took several years. After Cambridge, Philby worked as a journalist, first in Vienna, where he covered the growing political crisis and married an Austrian communist named Litzy Friedman. Then in Spain, where he reported on the Civil War from the Franco side, carefully cultivating the impression of a man sympathetic to the right. The impression was entirely fabricated, but it worked. It gave him exactly the kind of respectable, conservative profile that the British intelligence services, when they began recruiting in the late 1930s and early 1940s, found reassuring. He joined MI6 in 1940. The timing was extraordinarily fortunate for the Soviets, if for no one else. The war had just begun. MI6 was expanding rapidly, recruiting from exactly the class of educated, well-connected men that Philby represented. Security vetting in those early years was minimal. A man's public school and Cambridge connections were considered more reliable indicators of trustworthiness than any formal background check. Philby had the right school, the right college, the right accent, the right friends. He was charming, competent, and apparently dedicated. Nicholas Elliott, who joined MI6 around the same time, later said that Philby was simply the most impressive intelligence officer he had ever encountered. Clear thinking, superb analytical ability, absolute reliability in a crisis. All of it was real. The competence was not an act. Philby was genuinely excellent at his job. He was also, simultaneously, doing an entirely different job for an entirely different employer. From the moment Philby joined MI6 in 1940, he began passing intelligence to his Soviet handlers. The method was simple and audacious. Each evening, he left the MI6 building with a briefcase full of reports and documents. He met his Soviet contact at a prearranged location, outlying districts of London, almost always outdoors, with elaborate counter-surveillance procedures involving, at minimum, 3 separate taxis, both to and from the meeting point. He handed over the documents. They were photographed overnight. The following morning, he returned the originals to MI6. He did this routinely, systematically, for years. He described the practice himself in his 1963 confession to Elliott. the document classified by the British government and only partially released by the National Archives in 2020, more than 50 years later. In it, he stated that he had passed to the Russians typed copies of pretty well all the intelligence reports he had access to at MI6, including the names of British agents working in neutral countries and information about British code-breaking against the Germans. The Soviets initially did not believe him. This is one of the most counterintuitive details of the entire case. The Cambridge Five passed an extraordinary volume of material to Moscow. Between 1941 and 1945 alone, the five men collectively passed the Soviets more than 20,000 documents. Blunt alone, 1,771 documents. Burgess, 40,605. McLean, 4,593. Cairncross, 5,832. And from Philby, whose total across 30 years was never fully counted, more than 900 documents in the MI6 years alone, plus the intelligence passed verbally across hundreds of meetings and dozens of lunches in Washington and Beirut. And yet the Soviet intelligence service was deeply suspicious that much of it was fabricated, that the whole operation was too good to be true, that men with such access to such information could not possibly have remained undetected, that the British must know, that the documents must be a deliberate plant. According to the later account of Yuri Modin, the Soviet controller who handled the Cambridge Five, Moscow came close on several occasions to concluding that Philby was a British double agent deliberately feeding them false information. He reported that about half the documents the British spies sent to Moscow were never even read. Because the Soviets couldn't believe anyone could be that deeply inside. The mistrust had a specific focus on Philby. The Soviets found it implausible that a man with a documented communist past, who had been openly socialist at Cambridge, who had married an Austrian communist, could have penetrated MI6 without the British security services knowing about his background. They were right that it was implausible. They were wrong about what it implied. The answer was not that Philby was a British plant. The answer was that MI6's vetting procedures were catastrophically inadequate, that class loyalty trumped security protocols in the British establishment, and that a man with the right school and the right accent could walk through doors that should have been bolted shut. In 1944, Philby was appointed head of the newly created anti-Soviet section of MI6. This is worth pausing on. The man responsible for running MI6's operations against Soviet intelligence, the man in charge of identifying and neutralizing Soviet agents inside British institutions, was himself a Soviet agent. He had access to every British operation against the KGB. He knew the identity of every British asset inside Soviet-controlled territory. He knew the methods, the communication channels, the cover stories, the vulnerabilities. Everything he learned in that role, he passed to Moscow. Every British agent whose existence came to his attention was burned. The most devastating single operation Philby destroyed was the Albanian subversion. In the late 1940s and early 1950s, MI6 and the CIA jointly planned an operation to destabilize the communist government of Albania, the most isolated and rigidly Stalinist state in Europe. The plan involved recruiting Albanian exiles, training them in Western Europe, and inserting them back into Albania to make contact with resistance networks, gather intelligence, and lay the groundwork for a potential uprising. Thousands of Albanian men were involved. Men who had left their country, lost their families, built new lives in exile, and were now being asked to go back into a system that would execute them if they were caught. They were caught. Almost without exception, the Albanian teams that were inserted into the country walked directly into ambushes. They were arrested at the border, at their safe houses, at the contact points they had been given before departure. The operations ran for several years, and they failed consistently, not because of poor planning or bad luck, but because the Soviets knew every detail in advance. Philby, who served as the chief MI6 liaison with the CIA for the Albanian operation, had given the Soviets everything: the insertion points, the timing, the names, the contact procedures. The men who went back were already dead when they crossed the border. In Washington from 1949 to 1951, serving as the chief British liaison between MI6 and the CIA and FBI, Philby had access to an intelligence picture that exceeded almost anything he had been able to provide from London. His primary CIA contact was James Jesus Angleton, the head of CIA counterintelligence, a brilliant, paranoid, Anglophile American who admired Philby enormously and trusted him completely. They lunched together regularly at Harvey's restaurant in Washington, long, boozy lunches during which Angleton, believing he was speaking to an ally, shared the most sensitive information the CIA possessed. Angleton briefed Philby on CIA operations in Eastern Europe, on American agent networks behind the Iron Curtain, on the state of American signals intelligence, on the CIA's assessment of Soviet capabilities and intentions. Every word went to Moscow. The crisis began in May 1951. Two members of the Cambridge Five, Donald Maclean and Guy Burgess, came under serious suspicion. British and American intelligence had been working for years to decrypt Soviet signals traffic from the 1940s. The Venona Project and the intercepts pointed clearly at a source within the British Foreign Office. By the spring of 1951, the evidence pointed to Maclean. Philby was one of a small number of people who knew about the investigation. He sent a warning to Burgess, who was then working at the British Embassy in Washington. The message was clear: Maclean had to leave immediately. On May 25, 1951, the very night before Maclean was scheduled to be formally interrogated, both Maclean and Burgess disappeared. They surfaced in Moscow days later. The defection was an immediate catastrophe for Philby. His connection to Burgess, who had been living in his Washington home, made him the obvious third man who had warned the other two. Suspicion fell on him immediately. He was interrogated. He was forced to resign from MI6. But the evidence was not sufficient for prosecution. British law required evidence that met courtroom standards. What intelligence services possessed was strong, but it was intelligence, not proof. And there was another factor, less official, but no less powerful. Philby was a product of the same class, the same schools, the same institutions as the men who were supposed to be investigating him. The idea that someone of his background, Trinity College, Westminster School, the son of a British diplomat, could be a Soviet agent was not simply implausible to his colleagues. For many of them, it was genuinely inconceivable. In 1955, Foreign Secretary Harold Macmillan stood up in the House of Commons and publicly cleared Philby of all charges. Elliot arranged for him to return to MI6 as an agent in Beirut, covering the Middle East for The Economist and The Observer, while simultaneously providing intelligence to both MI6 and the KGB. Philby was back, still on both payrolls, still passing everything he knew. The end came from an unexpected direction. In 1961, a KGB officer named Anatoly Golitsyn defected to the United States from his posting in Helsinki. Golitsyn had knowledge of Soviet penetration operations against Western intelligence services. In his debriefings, he provided information that pointed, with increasing specificity, toward a senior British intelligence officer. The head of MI6, Dick White, had long suspected Philby. Golitsyn's information confirmed his suspicions with enough specificity to act. Elliot was sent to Beirut. When Elliot confronted Philby in that Beirut apartment, he was not simply confronting a Soviet agent, he was confronting his closest friend. Elliot had believed in Philby through everything, through the defection of Burgess and McLean, when suspicion fell on Philby like a shadow, through the years of investigation, when MI6 officers pressed their case, through the 1955 press conference at which Philby had denied everything with such practiced calm. Elliot had defended him. He had vouched for him. He had told people that he knew Kim Philby, that he was not a traitor, that the accusations were the product of institutional paranoia. He had been completely, utterly, catastrophically wrong. Their conversation in the wired apartment lasted several days across 2 meetings, January 9th and 11th, 1963. To the MI6 officers listening through the recording equipment, the conversation sounded, in the words of one account, genteel, polite, and boozy. The 2 men drank. They spoke to each other as old friends. The register was that of a private conversation between 2 members of the same world. In reality, it was an unsparing, bare-knuckle fight, the death throes of a bloodied friendship. Well, Elliot had come with specific evidence. He laid it out. He told Philby what they knew. He offered immunity from prosecution in exchange for full cooperation, a complete account of everything Philby had done, every agent he had compromised, every operation he had betrayed. Philby confirmed the espionage. He described his activities. He provided a partial account, but not a complete one. He hesitated when asked to sign a written statement. He requested time. Another meeting was scheduled for later in January. Elliot returned to London. Here is the detail of the Elliot confrontation that most accounts simplify. Philby's partial confession, controlled, careful, designed to reveal enough to seem cooperative without revealing everything, may not have been a desperate improvisation. Some intelligence historians have suggested that the entire confrontation was a managed operation, that Philby, knowing he had been definitively identified, orchestrated his own apparent willingness to confess precisely in order to buy time to arrange his escape. The partial confession created a situation where MI6 had reason to believe Philby was cooperating. It created reason to delay issuing an alert. It created reason not to have him arrested immediately. And it gave him 12 days. On the evening of January 23, 1963, Philby failed to appear at a dinner party at the home of the British Embassy's first secretary. His wife Eleanor had no idea where he was. She had no idea, after more than 3 years of marriage, that she was married to a man who had been a Soviet agent since before she was born. The Soviet freighter Dolmatova had left Beirut that morning. It had departed so abruptly that cargo was left scattered on the docks. It was bound for Odessa. Philby was on it. British intelligence decided not to issue an alert on his disappearance, fearing that the press would obtain the story before the government could control the narrative. It was not until July 1, 1963, more than 5 months after he vanished, that Philby's defection to Moscow was officially confirmed. There is a question about the Elliot confrontation that has never been fully answered. The partial release of the National Archives file KV24737 in 2020 did not resolve it because significant portions remain classified. The question is whether Philby was allowed to escape. Some intelligence historians, including Ben McIntyre, have suggested that elements of the British establishment, people who had known Philby, who had protected him, who were embarrassed by what a full public trial would reveal, may have been content to see him go. A trial would have required the disclosure of exactly what he had known, what he had passed, what he tsumuts, what he had destroyed. It would have revealed the full scope of MI6's failure. It would have illuminated the class blindness that had allowed a Soviet agent to operate at the highest levels of British intelligence for nearly 3 decades. Moscow was, in certain ways, tidier. Philby arrived in Moscow in January 1963 and discovered that it was not what he had been promised. He had been led to believe he would be welcomed as a colonel in the KGB, a senior officer, valued and respected, given responsibility and status in the organization he had served for 30 years. He had imagined, in the way that idealists sometimes imagine the fulfillment of their commitments, that the Soviet Union he arrived in would resemble the Soviet Union he had decided to serve as a young man at Cambridge. Neither of these things was true. He was paid 500 rubles a month, a comparatively generous salary by Soviet standards, but not the recognition of a valued colleague. His family could not join him immediately. He was placed under what amounted to virtual house arrest, with all visitors screened by the KGB. He was given no rank, no office. For the first 10 years in Moscow, he was largely frozen out. The KGB's concern was specific. They feared that Philby, feeling disillusioned and marginalized, might attempt to return to the West. The very qualities that had made him useful, his intelligence, his adaptability, his ability to read institutional situations, made him dangerous in Moscow. It would be 10 years before he was given a minor role in the training of KGB recruits, a small, grudging acknowledgement of what he had done. He dealt with the exile in the ways available to him. He read the Times, which was not generally available in the Soviet Union, through a special arrangement. He listened to the BBC World Service. He followed cricket obsessively. He wrote his memoirs, published in Britain in 1968, under the title My Silent War. In the book, he described his espionage with a kind of cold precision, defending his choices and characterizing himself not as a double agent, but as what he called a straight penetration agent working in the Soviet interest. He had never deceived the Soviets, he said. He had always been entirely committed to their cause. The only people he had deceived were the British. The damage he had caused was of a kind that cannot be fully counted. The Albanian operation alone involved thousands of men who were inserted into a country where Philby had arranged their capture. Some were executed immediately. Some were imprisoned for years. Some managed to escape. The exact number of deaths directly attributable to Philby's betrayal of that operation has never been established. The records on the Soviet and Albanian side remain largely inaccessible. Beyond Albania, the number of individual agents compromised by Philby's intelligence, British agents in Eastern Europe, American agents briefed during his Washington tenure, Soviet citizens who had approached Western intelligence and whose identities he had passed to Moscow, runs into hundreds. For most of them, the consequence of being identified as a Western asset, Kimaptis, in a Soviet-controlled country, was execution. James Jesus Angleton, the CIA counterintelligence chief who had trusted Philby completely and been bled of American secrets across years of Washington lunches, never recovered from the betrayal. The realization that his closest British liaison had been a Soviet agent for the entire duration of their relationship produced in Angleton a form of professional collapse that consumed the rest of his career. He became convinced, rationally, given his experience, that Soviet penetration of Western intelligence was deeper and more systematic than anyone had acknowledged. He pursued mole hunts inside the CIA with an obsessive thoroughness that destroyed careers, paralyzed operations, and generated an atmosphere of institutional paranoia that persisted for years after his own forced retirement in 1974. Philby had made it impossible for Angleton to trust anyone. That was perhaps the most lasting damage, not the specific secrets passed, not the specific agents burned, but the institutional wound, the doubt, the paranoia, the inability to function normally, that the revelation of his betrayal left in its wake. The Cambridge Five were never prosecuted. Not one of the 5 men who passed tens of thousands of documents to the Soviet Union from inside the British government and intelligence services was ever brought to trial. McLean and Burgess defected and died in Moscow. Philby defected and died in Moscow. Blunt was given immunity in exchange for a private confession and was publicly exposed only in 1979. His Order of the British Empire cancelled, his Surveyor of the Queen's Pictures title stripped, but no charge ever filed. Cairncross confessed in the 1960s and was never prosecuted for reasons the British government declined to explain. The reason, in all 5 cases, was the same. A trial would require the public disclosure of what they had known, what they had passed, and what those disclosures had cost. It would require an accounting of the class blindness, the institutional failures, the personal loyalties that had allowed 5 men from Cambridge to operate at the highest levels of British intelligence for decades without being caught. The British establishment, having been penetrated, chose to protect itself from the knowledge of the penetration. What remains in the end is a set of numbers that cannot be made less than what they are. Between 1941 and 1945 alone, 1,771 documents from Blunt, 4,605 from Burgess, 4,593 from McLean, 5,032 from Cairncross, and from Philby, whose total across 30 years was never fully counted, more than 900 documents in the MI6 years alone. And the note in the Soviet archives recorded by Yuri Modin, their controller, that about half the documents the British spies sent to Moscow were never even read, because the Soviets didn't believe anyone could be that deeply inside. Philby said in his later years that he considered himself not a traitor, but a patriot, that his loyalty had always been to an idea rather than to a country, that the Soviet Union was the expression of that idea, that he had never wavered. He died on May 11, 1988, in Moscow. He was 76 years old. He was buried with full KGB honors, the medals, the ceremony, the formal recognition that had been largely withheld during the decades he spent alive in the city. Nicholas Elliott, the man who had confronted him in Beirut, lived with the consequences of having been Philby's closest friend for the rest of his own life. He died in 1994. He never spoke publicly about whether he had deliberately allowed Philby to escape. The transcript of their conversations, National Archives file KV2-4737, was released in part in 2020. Significant portions remain classified. The British government's position, according to documents released by The Guardian in 2020, was that it had intentionally conducted a campaign to keep Philby's spying confidential to minimize political embarrassment. Minimize political embarrassment. The Kim Philby's portrait does not hang in any intelligence headquarters. The man who nearly destroyed the Western intelligence establishment from within, who operated undetected for nearly 30 years, who was publicly cleared by a British Foreign Secretary in 1955, 5 years before he resumed active spying in Beirut, died in Moscow with Soviet medals and a copy of the Times. The question his case asks is not whether he was brilliant. He clearly was. The question is how a system so convinced of its own judgment, so certain that the right school and the right accent and the right friends constituted adequate evidence of loyalty, how a system that trusted its own kind so completely and so blindly, how that system was supposed to protect anything at all. It wasn't, and it didn't.